The morning sun cast long shadows across the twisted metal and scorched concrete of Pearl Harbor as Lieutenant Commander Joseph Rochefort hunched over his desk, surrounded by towers of intercepted Japanese messages. It was late April 1942, and the cryptanalyst hadn't seen his family in weeks. His uniform was wrinkled, his eyes bloodshot, but his mind was sharper than ever. Something big was coming. He could feel it in the patterns of enemy communications, in the increased radio traffic that flowed through Station Hypo like a river threatening to burst its banks. Outside his windowless office in the basement of the 14th Naval District Administration building, the Pacific Fleet was a shadow of its former self. 4 battleships lay on the harbour bottom. Hundreds of aircraft had been destroyed. More than 2,000 Americans had died on that infamous December morning. The Japanese had struck with precision and overwhelming force, leaving America's Pacific defences in ruins. But Rochefort knew something the Japanese didn't. The Americans weren't beaten. They were learning, adapting, and preparing to strike back. "Sir, another intercept from the Japanese Fourth Fleet," said one of his cryptanalysts, placing a freshly decoded message on Rochefort's cluttered desk. The young officer's face showed the strain of endless hours spent wrestling with the enemy's naval code. "They're requesting additional supplies for something called Operation MI." Rochefort's tired eyes suddenly blazed with intensity. For weeks, his team had been tracking fragments of a massive Japanese operation. The enemy was planning something that would dwarf even Pearl Harbor. But where? When? The coded designation AF appeared repeatedly in the intercepts, taunting them with its mystery. If they could crack this puzzle, they might turn the tide of the entire war. Admiral Chester Nimitz stood at the window of his headquarters, gazing out at the salvage crews still working to raise the sunken battleships. The white-haired Texan had taken command of the Pacific Fleet at its darkest hour, inheriting a demoralized force and an enemy that seemed unstoppable. Behind him, his intelligence officer, Commander Edwin Layton, cleared his throat nervously. "Admiral, Rochefort's team believes they've identified a pattern in the Japanese communications," Layton reported. "Something major is being planned for early June. The scale suggests it's their largest operation since the war began." Nimitz turned from the window, his ice-blue eyes focused intently on Layton. The Admiral had learned to trust his intelligence officers, even when their conclusions seemed impossible. Unlike many senior commanders who dismissed code-breaking as unreliable guesswork, Nimitz understood that information was the most powerful weapon in modern warfare. "How certain are they?" Nimitz asked, his voice carrying the weight of command. Every decision he made could mean life or death for thousands of sailors and Marines. "Rochefort stakes his career on it, sir," Layton replied without hesitation. "He believes the target is somewhere in the Central Pacific. His team is working around the clock to pinpoint the exact location." The Admiral nodded slowly. If Rochefort was right, this could be the opportunity they desperately needed. The Japanese had been advancing across the Pacific like a tidal wave, capturing island after island, building an empire that stretched from the home islands to the shores of Australia. But every empire had its limits, and perhaps the enemy was finally overreaching. Down in the Cryptanalysis Center, Rochefort's team worked with feverish intensity. The basement room was thick with cigarette smoke and the smell of stale coffee. Banks of IBM tabulating machines clattered endlessly, sorting through thousands of code groups. Men and women in rumpled uniforms pored over worksheets, searching for patterns in the seemingly random characters. "I've got something," announced Lieutenant Commander Wesley Ham Wright, one of Rochefort's top cryptanalysts. "The Japanese keep referencing water desalination equipment for AF. Why would they need special water supplies for a major naval base?" Rochefort felt the pieces clicking into place. A location that would need additional water supplies, somewhere strategically important enough to warrant a massive operation. His mind raced through the possibilities, and suddenly he knew it had to be Midway Atoll, the tiny American outpost that guarded the approaches to Hawaii. One of his subordinates, Lieutenant Commander Jasper Holmes, proposed an ingenious plan. What if we have Midway report water supply problems? If the Japanese mention it in their coded traffic, we'll know AF is Midway. Get me a secure line to Leighton, Rochefort ordered. Tell Midway to send an emergency message in plain language saying their water distillation plant has broken down. Meanwhile, aboard the carrier USS Enterprise, Admiral William Bull Halsey lay in sick bay, his body ravaged by a severe case of dermatitis. The aggressive commander who had led the early carrier raids against Japanese-held islands was now too ill to stand. His task force was about to sail into the most important battle of the war, and he wouldn't be leading it. "Bill, you look like hell," said Admiral Raymond Spruance, visiting his old friend. The two men were opposites in many ways. Halsey was bold and instinctive, while Spruance was calculating and methodical. But they shared a deep respect for each other and an unshakable determination to defeat Japan. "Ray, I'm giving you my command," Halsey said weakly. "Take my boys and hit those bastards hard. They trust you, and so do I." Spruance nodded solemnly. He had never led carriers in combat before, but he understood the principles of naval warfare better than almost anyone. More importantly, he knew how to listen to his subordinates and make decisions based on facts rather than emotion. These qualities would soon be tested in ways no one could imagine. On Midway itself, Marine Colonel Harold Shannon inspected his ragtag collection of aircraft. The tiny Atoll's air group was a mixed bag of obsolete Brewster Buffalo fighters, already proven inferior to the Japanese Zero, alongside a handful of newer Wildcat fighters and various bombers. His pilots were mostly green, fresh from training with little combat experience. "Colonel, are we really expected to stop the Japanese Navy with these?" asked Major Lofton Henderson, gesturing at the lined-up Buffaloes. The Marine aviator knew the reputation of these planes, nicknamed flying coffins by their pilots. "We'll stop them or die trying," Shannon replied grimly. "Every minute we can delay them gives the Navy a better chance to hit their carriers. That's our job, Major. Buy time with everything we've got." Back at Pearl Harbor, confirmation came through that electrified Rochefort's team. Japanese intelligence had reported in their coded messages that AF was experiencing water shortages. The target was definitely Midway. Armed with this crucial intelligence, Nimitz called his senior commanders to an urgent meeting. "Gentlemen, we know where they're going and approximately when," Nimitz announced to the assembled officers. "The Japanese are sending at least 4 carriers to attack Midway in early June. This is our chance to ambush them." Captain Miles Browning, Halsey's chief of staff who would now serve under Spruance, studied the intelligence reports. "Sir, our pilots are reporting at least 6 Japanese carriers operational. If they bring them all—" "They won't," Nimitz interrupted with quiet confidence. "Our intelligence indicates they're splitting their forces. 2 carriers are heading for the Aleutians as a diversion. That leaves 4 for Midway, and we'll be waiting with 3. The mathematics were still daunting. The Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu and Hiryu, were veterans of Pearl Harbor and the Indian Ocean raids. Their pilots were the best in the world, with years of combat experience. The American carriers, Enterprise, Hornet and Yorktown, had brave crews but far less experience. Moreover, Yorktown had been badly damaged at the Battle of Coral Sea and was limping back to Pearl Harbor. "How long to repair Yorktown?" Nimitz asked, turning to his maintenance officer. 3 months minimum, Admiral." She took bomb hits that went deep into her structure. There's significant damage to her flight deck and fuel systems. "You have 3 days, Nimitz said flatly. "Whatever it takes, I want that ship operational and sailing with the others." The maintenance officer's jaw dropped, but he saw the determination in Nimitz's eyes. "Yes, sir. We'll work around the clock." As May drew to a close, Pearl Harbor became a hive of desperate activity. 1,400 workers swarmed over Yorktown, welding, hammering, and installing new equipment. The repairs that should have taken months were compressed into 72 hours of superhuman effort. Men worked until they collapsed from exhaustion, knowing that every rivet they drove, every plate they welded, might make the difference between victory and defeat. Lieutenant Commander John Thatch, one of the Navy's premier fighter tacticians, gathered his pilots aboard Yorktown. He had developed new tactics specifically to counter the superior maneuverability of the Japanese Zero, which had dominated every aerial engagement so far. "Listen up," Thatch addressed his young aviators. "The Zero can outturn us, outclimb us, and it's faster. But it's lightly built. Our Wildcats can take punishment and keep flying. We're going to use a new formation I call the Thatch Weave. Work in pairs, cover each other, and never try to dogfight a Zero one-on-one." Among the pilots was Ensign George Gay, fresh from flight school with barely 300 hours of flight time. The young Texan tried to hide his nervousness as Thatch explained how they would attack the Japanese fleet. The torpedo bombers would go in low and slow, perfect targets for enemy fighters and anti-aircraft fire. Everyone knew it was practically a suicide mission, but no one voiced their fears. In the intelligence offices, analysts worked to piece together the complete Japanese order of battle. They knew Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, was personally commanding the operation. The strike force would be led by Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, who had commanded at Pearl Harbor. The intelligence painted a picture of overwhelming Japanese confidence. They were coming to finish what they had started 6 months earlier. "They're bringing everything," reported one of Nimitz's planning officers. "Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, transports with invasion troops. They intend to take Midway and use it as a base for further operations against Hawaii." "Let them come," Nimitz responded calmly. "The bigger the force, the more they have to lose." On May 28th, Task Force 16, centered on Enterprise and Hornet under Spruance's command, slipped out of Pearl Harbor. The carriers were screened by cruisers and destroyers, their crews at battle stations. 2 days later, on May 30th, Yorktown followed, her hull still bearing fresh welds and patches. The 3 carriers would rendezvous northeast of Midway at a position designated Point Luck, perfectly positioned to ambush the approaching Japanese. Aboard Enterprise, Spruance studied the latest intelligence updates with his staff. The quiet admiral was known for his analytical mind and careful planning. Unlike the impulsive Halsey, Spruance calculated every move, considering all possibilities before making decisions. "The Japanese expect to achieve surprise," Spruance told his staff. "They believe our carriers are still in the South Pacific or back at Pearl Harbor. That overconfidence is our greatest advantage. We must use it wisely." Commander Wade McClusky, commanding Enterprise's air group, prepared his pilots for what lay ahead. A veteran naval aviator, McClusky understood both the capabilities and limitations of his aircraft and men. "When we find their carriers, we hit them with everything we've got," McClusky briefed his squadron commanders. "The dive bombers will attack from high altitude while the torpedo planes go in low. Fighter cover will be limited, so speed and surprise are essential." Among McClusky's pilots was Lieutenant Richard Dick Best, commanding Bombing Squadron 6. Best was known for his exceptional accuracy in dive bombing, a skill that would soon prove crucial. He gathered his own pilots for a more detailed briefing. "Remember, we're looking for their carriers, not the battleships or cruisers," Best emphasized. "I don't care how tempting the other targets look. We sink their carriers, and we win this war." As May turned to June, both fleets moved toward their fateful encounter. The Americans had positioned themselves perfectly, thanks to their code-breaking success. But intelligence was only part of the equation. The coming battle would be decided by the skill and courage of the pilots, the decisions of commanders under extreme pressure, and the thin margin between victory and disaster that characterized carrier warfare. On Midway itself, preparations reached a fever pitch. Every available aircraft was armed and fueled. Marines dug defensive positions in the coral sand. Radar operators scanned the skies continuously. knowing that the first warning of the Japanese approach would come from their screens. The garrison knew they were vastly outnumbered, but they also knew their role. Hold out long enough for the Navy to strike the enemy carriers. Commander Cyril Simard, Midway's senior officer, made a final inspection of the defences. The atoll's 2 small islands were packed with ammunition, fuel tanks and aircraft. One well-placed bomb could turn the entire base into an inferno. But there was no choice. Everything depended on Midway holding out long enough for the carriers to do their work. As darkness fell on June 3, 1942, American PBY Catalina patrol planes spread out from Midway in long search patterns. These slow, ungainly aircraft would be the first to spot the approaching enemy. Their crews knew that making contact with the Japanese fleet meant almost certain death, as the lumbering patrol planes were easy prey for Zero fighters. But finding the enemy was worth any sacrifice. At 0900 on June 3rd, Ensign Jack Reed, piloting a PBY, spotted ships on the horizon. "Sighted main body," he radioed. "Bearing 262, distance 700 miles. The Japanese invasion force had been found, but the carriers remained hidden. That afternoon, 9 B-17s from Midway attacked the invasion convoy but scored no hits. 4 PBYs equipped with torpedoes attempted a night attack, claiming 1 hit. While these attacks caused no significant damage, they alerted the Japanese that the Americans knew they were coming. At 0300 on June 4th, reveille sounded aboard the American carriers. In ready rooms, pilots received final briefings and wrote last letters home. Mechanics made final checks on aircraft. Ordnance crews loaded bombs and torpedoes. 3 carriers with barely 230 aircraft were about to take on the pride of the Japanese Navy. The odds were steep, but the Americans had advantages. They knew the enemy was coming, they knew where to find them, and they had commanders willing to take calculated risks. Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, in overall command aboard Yorktown, made the decision that would govern American tactics for the coming battle. Rather than keeping his carriers together for mutual protection, he would operate them separately, reducing the risk of all 3 being caught together. It was a gamble, but the entire operation was a gamble on a massive scale. As dawn approached on June 4, 1942, the stage was set for one of the most decisive battles in naval history. The Japanese came in supreme confidence, expecting to catch the Americans by surprise. Instead, they were sailing into a carefully prepared trap. The US Navy, battered but not broken at Pearl Harbor, was about to demonstrate that American determination and ingenuity could overcome even the most daunting odds. At 0430 hours on June 4th, the pre-dawn darkness over Midway was shattered by the roar of aircraft engines. Lieutenant Commander Joichi Tomonaga led 108 Japanese aircraft from the 4 carriers toward their target. The attack force included 36 torpedo bombers carrying conventional bombs for ground attack, 36 dive bombers, and 36 Zero fighters for escort. As they formed up in the darkness, not one of the Japanese aviators suspected that American carriers lurked nearby, waiting. On Midway, radar operators detected the incoming strike at 0552. Many planes bearing 320 degrees, distance 93 miles, the operator reported, his voice steady despite his racing heart. Air raid sirens wailed across the tiny atoll. Marines ran to their battle stations while pilots sprinted to their aircraft. Every flyable plane on Midway had to get airborne immediately or risk destruction on the ground. Major Lofton Henderson led Marine Scout Bombing Squadron 241 into the dawn sky, including his obsolete Buffalo fighters, knowing they were heading into a massacre. The Buffalo was slower, less maneuverable, and more lightly armed than the Zero. But Henderson's Marines had absolute determination to protect their base at any cost. "Enemy fighters, 12 o'clock high." The radio crackled with warnings as the Marines met the incoming strike force head-on. The Zeros pounced on the American fighters like hawks among pigeons. Within minutes, the sky was filled with burning American planes spiraling toward the ocean. Henderson's aircraft was among those shot down as he led his squadron's dive bombers in their attack. But the Marine sacrifice wasn't in vain. Their attack disrupted the Japanese formation and forced the bombers to take evasive action. More importantly, it bought precious time for Midway's bomber force to clear the island and head for the Japanese fleet, whose position had been reported by searching PBY patrol planes. At 0630, Tomonaga's force reached Midway and began their attack runs. Bombs rained down on the airfield, fuel tanks and defensive positions. The island's anti-aircraft guns blazed away, filling the sky with black puffs of smoke. A direct hit on the power station knocked out Midway's radar. Another bomb set the fuel tanks ablaze, sending thick columns of smoke into the morning sky. But as Tomonaga circled to assess the damage, he realized the attack had failed in its primary objective. The runways were cratered but repairable. Many defensive positions remained intact. Most critically, they had destroyed few aircraft on the ground because the Americans had gotten them airborne in time. Tomonaga radioed back to Admiral Nagumo. There is need for a second attack wave. This message would trigger a chain of decisions that would determine the battle's outcome. Aboard the Japanese carrier Akagi, Admiral Nagumo faced a dilemma. He had held back 93 aircraft armed with anti-ship weapons, torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, in case American ships appeared. Should he rearm them with ground attack weapons for a second strike on Midway, or keep them ready for naval targets? At 0715, Nagumo made his fateful decision. Rearm the aircraft with bombs for land attack. Crews immediately began the laborious process of removing torpedoes and replacing them with conventional bombs. It was dangerous work on crowded hangar decks, with armed ordnance being moved around volatile aviation fuel and ammunition. Unknown to Nagumo, 200 miles to the northeast, American carriers were already launching their strikes. Admiral Spruance, commanding Enterprise and Hornet, had made the crucial decision to launch everything he had at maximum range. It was a calculated risk. His planes would barely have enough fuel to return, but it would catch the Japanese at their most vulnerable moment. "Pilots, man your planes!" The order echoed across the American flight decks. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron led Hornet's Torpedo Squadron 8, knowing the odds against his slow, vulnerable Douglas TB Devastators. In his ready room briefing, he had been brutally honest with his men. "If we run out of gas, we'll ditch together. If only one of us makes it through, he'll hit a carrier. May God be with us all." Among Waldron's pilots was Ensign George Gay, the young Texan who would soon become the sole survivor of his squadron. As Gay climbed into his Devastator, he checked his rear gunner's position. Radio man Bob Huntington gave him a thumbs up, trying to mask his own fear with bravado. By 800, the American strike was airborne, but scattered. The different squadrons became separated in the clouds, each group proceeding independently toward the estimated Japanese position. This lack of coordination would prove both a weakness and, paradoxically, a strength in the coming engagement. Meanwhile, Nagumo's problems were multiplying. At 0728, a scout plane from the cruiser Tone finally reported 10 enemy surface ships bearing 10 degrees, distance 240 miles from Midway, course 150 degrees, speed 20 knots. The pilot hadn't identified ship types, a crucial oversight that left Nagumo uncertain whether he faced carriers or merely a surface force. "Suspend rearming operations," Nagumo ordered. But confusion reigned on the Japanese hangar decks. Some aircraft were fully rearmed, others were half-converted, and ordnance was scattered everywhere in the rush to complete the changeover. The delay would prove fatal. At 0820, the Tone Scout plane sent another report that chilled Nagumo's blood. "Enemy ships are accompanied by what appears to be a carrier." The Americans had carriers at sea, and his own aircraft were in chaos, caught between configurations. Worse, his first strike wave was returning from Midway, low on fuel and needing to land immediately. The first American attacks came from Midway-based aircraft, Marine dive bombers, and Army B-17s attacking from high altitude. These uncoordinated attacks scored no hits, and the Japanese carriers easily evaded the falling bombs. Zero fighters slaughtered the Marine planes, but each failed attack forced the Japanese carriers to maneuver, delaying flight operations. At 0920, Lieutenant Commander John Waldron spotted the Japanese fleet through breaks in the clouds. His torpedo squadron was alone, having become separated from the fighters and dive bombers. Waldron knew attacking without fighter cover was suicide, but he also knew this might be their only chance. "Attack immediately," Waldron ordered, leading his 15 devastators down toward the Japanese carriers. The Zeros were waiting. As the slow torpedo bombers lumbered toward their targets at wave-top height, the Japanese fighters attacked ferociously. One by one, the devastators burst into flames and crashed into the sea. Ensign Gay watched in horror as his squadron mates died around him. Waldron's plane was hit and cartwheeled into the ocean. Others exploded in mid-air or broke apart under the concentrated fire. Gay pressed on, his gunner Huntington firing desperately at the swarming Zeros until he was killed by a burst of cannon fire. Gay released his torpedo at the carrier Soryu, then flew directly over the ship so low he could see the faces of Japanese sailors. Moments later, his plane was riddled with bullets and crashed into the sea. Wounded but alive, Gay inflated his life jacket and hid under a floating seat cushion, becoming an unwilling spectator to the battle's climax. Torpedo Squadron 8 had been annihilated. All 15 devastators were shot down. Of 30 men, only George Gay survived. Their torpedoes, plagued by technical problems, either missed or failed to explode. But their sacrifice had not been in vain. The attack had pulled the Japanese fighter cover down to sea level, leaving the high altitudes undefended. More American torpedo squadrons arrived and met similar fates. Enterprise's Torpedo Squadron 6 lost 10 of 14 aircraft. Yorktown's Torpedo Squadron 3 lost 10 of 12. The obsolete devastators and their defective torpedoes seemed to validate Japanese confidence in their superiority. But the repeated attacks were forcing constant evasive maneuvers, preventing Nagumo from launching or recovering aircraft. By 1020, the Japanese carriers were in chaos. Returning aircraft from the Midway strike circled overhead, desperately low on fuel. The flight decks were crammed with aircraft being refueled and rearmed. Bombs and torpedoes were scattered on the hangar decks. Fire safety procedures were being ignored in the rush to prepare a strike against the American carriers. It was at this moment of maximum vulnerability that Commander Wade McClusky arrived overhead with 33 dive bombers from Enterprise. McClusky had led his squadrons on an exhausting search, flying beyond the point where fuel reserves allowed safe return. Just as he was about to turn back, he spotted a Japanese destroyer racing northeast. Correctly guessing it was heading to rejoin the main force, McClusky followed its course. At 10:22, McClusky's perseverance was rewarded. Through breaks in the clouds, he saw the Japanese carriers spread out below, their flight decks packed with aircraft. No Zeros challenged him at altitude. They were all at sea level, finishing off the last torpedo bombers. McClusky split his force, assigning squadrons to different targets, and gave the order millions of Americans had been waiting for since Pearl Harbor. Attack immediately. Lieutenant Dick Best led his squadron toward Akagi, Nagumo's flagship. As he pushed over into his dive, Best kept his eye on the growing shape of the carrier. At 2,500 feet, he released his 1,000-pound bomb and pulled out sharply. Behind him, his wingmen followed in precise sequence. Most bombs missed. The pilots were exhausted and diving through anti-aircraft fire, but Best's bomb was perfectly placed. It punched through Akagi's flight deck and exploded in the hangar deck among fueled and armed aircraft. The result was catastrophic. Secondary explosions rippled through the ship as fuel and ordnance detonated in a chain reaction. Within minutes, Akagi was an inferno. Simultaneously, Kaga was hit by at least 4 bombs from McClusky's other squadron, the hits started uncontrollable fires among the packed aircraft. At nearly the same time, Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie's dive bombers from Yorktown scored 3 direct hits on Soryu in a textbook attack. Within 6 minutes, 3 of Japan's premier carriers were burning wrecks. From his hiding place in the water, Ensign Gay watched the Japanese carriers explode. The ships that had seemed so invincible moments before were now funeral pyres. He could see Japanese sailors abandoning ship, leaping into the oil-covered ocean to escape the flames. The bodies of his squadron mates floated nearby, but their sacrifice had made this moment possible. Admiral Nagumo, forced to transfer his flag from the burning Akagi to a cruiser, was in shock. 3/4 of his striking power had been eliminated in minutes. Akagi, Kaga and Soryu were finished. Only Hiryu remained operational, racing northwest to escape while launching a counterstrike. The Japanese Navy's aura of invincibility, built through 6 months of victories, had been shattered. But the battle wasn't over. Hiryu's counterstrike found Yorktown early that afternoon. Despite determined defense by fighters and anti-aircraft fire, Japanese dive bombers scored 3 hits that left the American carrier burning and listing. Damage control parties fought desperately to save the ship, and their efforts seemed successful until a second strike by torpedo bombers put 2 more torpedoes into Yorktown's hull. Admiral Fletcher transferred to a cruiser, passing tactical command to Spruance. Yorktown's crew abandoned ship, but the tough carrier refused to sink. She would remain afloat until June 7th, when Japanese submarine Y-168 found her and delivered the final torpedo hits that sent her to the bottom. The loss of Yorktown was painful, but by then Hiryu had joined her sisters in destruction. Late on June 4th, dive bombers from Enterprise found the last Japanese carrier and left her burning from stem to stern. 4 Japanese carriers, the core of the force that had attacked Pearl Harbor, now lay on the bottom of the Pacific. As darkness fell on June 4th, American pilots returned to their carriers with barely fumes in their tanks. Many aircraft, damaged in combat or out of fuel, ditched in the darkening seas. Destroyers raced to rescue pilots from the water. The human cost had been high, but the strategic victory was complete. Admiral Spruance, cautious and calculating, resisted the temptation to pursue the retreating Japanese. He knew Yamamoto's battleships were somewhere in the darkness, and his pilots were exhausted. Better to preserve his victory than risk his carriers in a night engagement where battleship guns could be decisive. It was a controversial decision, but it proved correct. As June 5th dawned, American search planes found only burning hulks and scattered survivors where the Japanese fleet had been. The few remaining Japanese aircraft, launched from cruisers and the crippled carriers before they sank, made desperate attacks but achieved nothing. Over the next 2 days, American forces continued attacks on the retreating Japanese, sinking the heavy cruiser Mikuma and damaging other vessels. The statistics were staggering. Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers, 1 heavy cruiser, 248 aircraft, and 3,057 men, including many of their most experienced pilots. The Americans had lost 1 carrier, 1 destroyer, 147 aircraft, and 362 men. But the numbers only told part of the story. Japan's offensive capability in the Pacific had been permanently crippled. The initiative had passed to the Americans. In the aftermath, both sides sought to understand what had happened. For the Americans, the victory validated their faith in intelligence and calculated risk-taking. Nimitz's decision to trust his codebreakers, Spruance's careful tactical decisions, and the incredible courage of the pilots had combined to achieve what seemed impossible. For the Japanese, Midway was a stunning reversal that exposed fundamental flaws in their planning and doctrine. The assumption of superiority, the complex operational plan that dispersed their forces, the failure to adequately scout for American carriers, and the crucial minutes of vulnerability during the rearming process had all contributed to disaster. But perhaps the most important factor was the sacrifice of the American torpedo bomber crews. Their seemingly futile attacks had created the conditions for victory by disrupting Japanese operations and pulling down the fighter cover. Men like John Waldron and his squadron had known they were flying to almost certain death, but they pressed home their attacks anyway. As news of the victory spread, America erupted in celebration. After 6 months of defeat and retreat, the United States had won its first major victory against Japan. The road to Tokyo would be long and bloody, but Midway proved it could be travelled. The Japanese Navy, which had seemed invincible since Pearl Harbor, had been decisively beaten by a smaller American force. In Japan, the government hid the extent of the defeat from the public. Returning sailors were isolated to prevent word from spreading. The official story claimed a great victory, but the Navy knew the truth. The offensive phase of Japan's war was over. From now on, they would be on the defensive, trying to hold what they had conquered against an increasingly powerful American counteroffensive. The Battle of Midway became a turning point not just in the Pacific War, but in world history. It demonstrated that intelligence, properly used, could overcome numerical disadvantage. It showed that courage and sacrifice, even in apparent failure, could create opportunities for victory. Most importantly, it proved that the United States had the will and capability to defeat even the most formidable enemy. Admiral Nimitz, in his after-action report, gave credit where it was due, to the codebreakers who had uncovered the Japanese plan, to the commanders who had made crucial decisions under pressure, and above all to the pilots who had pressed home their attacks against overwhelming odds. But he also recognized the role of chance in war. Had the American dive bombers arrived 5 minutes later, after the Japanese had launched their strikes, the outcome might have been very different. The Japanese Navy would never recover from Midway. The 4 carriers lost represented years of construction and decades of pilot training that could not be replaced. While Japan would commission new carriers, they would never again achieve the combination of ships, aircraft, and experienced air crews that had made their early victories possible. For the young American pilots who survived, Midway was a defining moment. Men like Dick Best, who had placed the bomb that doomed Akagi, would continue flying throughout the war, but nothing would match the intensity of those few minutes over the Japanese fleet. Others, like Ensign Gay, would carry the memory of fallen comrades for the rest of their lives. The battle also marked a revolution in naval warfare. For the first time, a major naval engagement had been fought entirely by aircraft, with the opposing fleets never coming within sight of each other. The age of the battleship was ending. The aircraft carrier was now the dominant weapon of naval warfare. In the broader context of World War II, Midway was America's Stalingrad, the point where a seemingly unstoppable advance was not just halted, but reversed. Combined with the grinding attrition of Guadalcanal that would follow, it marked the beginning of Japan's long retreat across the Pacific. The industrial might of America, fully mobilized for war, would produce ships and aircraft in quantities Japan could never match. The veterans of Midway would go on to fight in the Solomons, the Philippines, and eventually to the doorstep of Japan itself. They had learned that the Japanese could be beaten, that American training and equipment, properly employed, were more than a match for enemy skill and determination. For Japan, Midway exposed the fatal flaw in their strategic planning. They had begun a war against an enemy with 10 times their industrial capacity, believing that spiritual superiority could overcome material disadvantage. The Americans had shown at Midway that they possessed both material strength and the will to use it. The codebreakers who had made victory possible received little public recognition during the war. Their work remained classified for decades. But officers like Rochefort and his team had arguably won the most important intelligence victory in American history. By solving the puzzle of AF and predicting Japanese movements, they had given Nimitz the information needed to position his forces perfectly. Lieutenant Commander Rochefort, despite his crucial role, would be reassigned shortly after Midway due to bureaucratic conflicts with Washington. His team's success had proven that intelligence could win battles, but inter-service rivalries would prevent him from receiving proper recognition until decades later. In 1986, he was posthumously awarded the Navy Distinguished Service Medal. As the years passed, Midway took on almost mythical status in American military history. It became the textbook example of how intelligence, courage, and tactical excellence could combine to achieve victory against superior forces. Military academies around the world studied the battle, seeking to understand how the Americans had achieved such a complete reversal of fortune. The human dimension of Midway should never be forgotten. Behind the strategic movements and tactical decisions were individual acts of heroism that determined the outcome. The Marine pilots who flew obsolete fighters against Zeros, the torpedo bomber crews who pressed their attacks without fighter cover, the dive bomber pilots who searched past the point of safe return, the damage control parties who saved ships, all contributed to victory. The Battle of Midway proved that democracies could fight and win against totalitarian enemies. The American carriers were crewed by citizen sailors, many of whom had been civilians just months before. They faced an enemy with years of combat experience and a tradition of victory. Yet when the moment came, these Americans performed with skill and courage that matched anything in their nation's history. The lesson of Midway resonates beyond its historical moment. It reminds us that apparent weakness can be turned to strength through intelligence and determination. That sacrifice, even in failure, can create opportunities for others. That technological superiority means nothing without the will to use it effectively, and that free nations, when threatened, can summon the courage to defend themselves against any odds. As the sun set on June 4, 1942, the tide of the Pacific War had turned decisively. The Japanese would fight on with characteristic determination for 3 more years, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. At Midway, a smaller American force had destroyed the heart of Japanese naval power and seized the initiative. Admiral Yamamoto's pre-war prediction had proven prophetic. He had warned that he could run wild for 6 months or a year, but after that he had no confidence. Midway occurred exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor. The architect of Japan's early victories had understood that once America recovered and mobilized its strength, Japan's defeat was inevitable. At Midway, that inevitability became reality, written in the burning hulks of 4 aircraft carriers and the sacrifice of brave men who fought and died for their nations in the vast Pacific sky. The impact of Midway extended far beyond the immediate tactical victory. It demonstrated that the United States could gather intelligence, plan operations, and execute complex naval battles with precision. The coordination between codebreakers, planners, and combat forces had created a new model for modern warfare. Future operations would build on these lessons, combining intelligence gathering with tactical execution. For the individual sailors and airmen who fought at Midway, the battle represented a personal triumph over fear and adversity. Young men who had never seen combat performed acts of extraordinary courage. Mechanics worked through exhaustion to keep planes flying. Damage control teams saved ships that should have sunk. Radio operators maintained communications under fire. Each person's contribution, no matter how small, had helped achieve victory. The Japanese pilots and sailors who fought at Midway also displayed remarkable courage and skill. Despite the disaster that befell their carriers, they fought with determination until the end. Many chose death over surrender, going down with their ships or flying their damaged aircraft into the sea rather than be captured. Their sacrifice, though in a losing cause, reflected the warrior tradition that had made them such formidable opponents. In the aftermath of Midway, both navies would apply the lessons learned. The Americans would refine their carrier tactics, improve their aircraft, and develop better torpedoes. The Japanese would struggle to rebuild their carrier forces and train new pilots to replace those lost. But the fundamental shift in momentum could not be reversed. America's industrial production would soon flood the Pacific with new ships and planes, while Japan's resources dwindled. The Battle of Midway stands as one of history's most decisive naval engagements. In the span of a few minutes on June 4, 1942, the course of the Pacific War changed forever. American dive bombers, arriving at the perfect moment, struck Japanese carriers at their most vulnerable. The resulting destruction ended Japan's offensive capabilities and began the long American advance across the Pacific. Today, Midway Atoll is a wildlife refuge, its runways abandoned and its facilities crumbling. But the waters around it remain hallowed ground, where brave men from both nations fought and died in a battle that shaped the modern world. Their sacrifice reminds us that freedom requires vigilance, that intelligence and preparation can overcome seemingly insurmountable odds, and that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things when their nation's survival is at stake. The legacy of Midway lives on in the United States Navy's emphasis on intelligence, carrier aviation, and flexible tactics. It proved that naval warfare had entered a new age, where information was as important as firepower, where aircraft could sink the mightiest ships, and where victory went to those who could adapt fastest to changing circumstances. These lessons continue to guide naval strategy in the 21st century. As we remember Midway, we honour not just the victory, but the men who achieved it. From Admiral Nimitz making strategic decisions at Pearl Harbor, to Ensign Gay floating in the ocean watching his squadron's sacrifice bear fruit, each participant played a vital role. Their combined efforts turned potential defeat into decisive victory, changing the course of history and demonstrating that free peoples, united in purpose, can overcome any challenge. The Battle of Midway was more than a military victory. It was a triumph of intelligence over ignorance, preparation over complacency, and courage over fear. It showed that America had the will and ability to fight a global war and win. Most importantly, it proved that the values of democracy and freedom, defended by brave men and women, could prevail against tyranny and aggression. That lesson, learned in the waters around a tiny Pacific atoll, remains as relevant today as it was on that fateful June morning in 1942.